Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. The festival is going to change tempos a little bit. For those of you who were here yesterday, we had a standing ovation. We had musicians playing from various parts of the world, and it was truly magical. You missed it. If you weren't there, you really missed something. But changing tempos tonight, we are presenting Grasping Greatness, Making India a Leading Power. And the book has been edited by three of India's most eminent scholars. And we have I've got the book in my hand, but it's not available today. You can get it on portals like online. But it's been edited by ASHK. He's not joining us tonight, but the two who are joining us is Bibek Debroy. He's going to join us via Zoom, and we've got Mohan, who will be joining us as well in person. He's right here with us. Moderating the session is Ajay Kapur, and I'm going to leave it to him to tell you a little bit more about the speakers on our panel, but a little bit about Ajay. Ajay has studied a lot. So I'm going to go through his many degrees. He's right here in front of me. But Ajay is a Hong Kong global market strategist. He's worked in Hong Kong as well as New York. And he has he got his first degree in economics from Stevens. Then he went on to do a degree in management from the Indian Institute of Management. And he went on further to study. He did his master's in public administration at Princeton University. He researches and writes on global markets and their correlations to economies in general. So I'm going to invite Ajay on stage first, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about our panelists. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I think we're in for a treat today. So my name is Ajay, and we have two panelists today, one on Zoom. And Raja, maybe I want to invite you to come up. Let me introduce you first, and then I can see Vivek's up there. So let me start with why we're here. We're here to talk about this book called Grasping Greatness. 650 pages, I read all of them. Luckily, there's no bibliography. Very interesting, highly insightful, very analytical. So congratulations, both of you, and Ashley, your co-editor, on putting this together. And so this is under the rubric in this festival of literature. And so if you think we're discussing, Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, or Shakespeare's Flawless and Cressida, or Tagore's Gitanjali, that's, you're in the wrong place. So it's sort of literature, but with a different angle on grasping greatness. And then we'll talk about the title in a second. But let me introduce Bibek first. So Bibek, I've done a lot of these introductions, and your resume is the most interesting one I've come across for decades. So your official job is the president of the ISI, Indian Statistical Institute. You are the chairman of the EAC, Economic Advisory Council, Prime Minister of India. Those are two pretty serious titles already. That's your sort of day job. You're an economist. You went to Presidency College, and then went on to Cambridge. You studied with the great Frank Mohan on general equilibrium economics, or whatever that is. That's the sort of econ part, and then the real world stuff. But what I found more fascinating about you, Bibek, is you've written a book called Inked in India, which is about pens and ink. I haven't read it yet, but I intend to. You have your own TV show, Itihas, on the Parliament channel, Sunset channel. And if that wasn't enough to keep you busy, you've translated the great Indian epics, the Mahabharata, which a lot of you know, the Ramayana, the Vedas. And so a lot of you might think that the Iliad is the longest poem in the world. Wrong. The Mahabharata is 8.5 times longer. And so Vivek translated this gigantic epic from Sanskrit, which that's another language, to English. And then if that wasn't enough, did a few more books. So I did some research on was it the longest epic in the world, and that's wrong. It's from Kyrgyzstan, the story of Manas, which is 2.5 times bigger than Mahabharata. So just a general knowledge bullet point. So that's Vivek, a translator, and we might call upon your knowledge of our history and culture and see how it gels with this great power stuff, because that's a bit of a debate. So that's Vivek. Sitting next to me is Raja Mohan, Dr. Raja Mohan, to be precise. Your real job is you are the sort of director at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi. You're also a visiting professor at the NUS, National University of Singapore. You have a master's degree in nuclear physics and a PhD in international relations. So these are public intellectuals, gigantic intellectual horsepower. So we're very lucky that we have them both here to help us understand what this book is about. And so I've introduced you both. I want to introduce the book. So that's the book, Grasping Greatness. Grasping, as you know, it's a good word. It's a gerund. You know what a gerund is. It's a doing verb, as in running, eating, and so on. So in other words, it's like a present tense. It's a work in progress, I assume. What you might say, grasp. So grasping. And grasp, I think, is a good word too, because no one makes you a leading power just like that, right? No one hands it to you. So I found the title to be perfect. It's what Kennedy said about the sort of space program, right? We want to do this, not because it's easy, but for this hard. And then so the subtitle is Making India a Leading Power. So again, another gerund, making, work in progress. Okay, so there are 3 parts in this book. There are 16 authors, 13 chapters. Some more interesting than the others. But your chapters were amazing, right? Yours was on the epilogue, and Bibek, yours was on improving the Indian cabinet. No comment there. So we will let you talk about that. So there are 3 components to this book. To become a great power, it's sort of obvious, you need the economy to do well. And so Vivek is going to help us with that, with the economy. You need, the second part is the state capacity, which is that the government, the state needs to be strong enough to push that objective through. And then last is international relations, which is your bailiwick. So why don't I invite both of you to perhaps give us a 5-minute overview of your particular field. So for you, Raja, it'll be international relations, state capacity. But Vivek, I want you to start with your field, which is the economy, and what you think, what India needs to grow, for how long, and what rate, why it will do that to get even close to being a leading power. So just to give you context today, the US is 25 trillion US GDP, China is 20 trillion, India is about 3.7 trillion. Okay, so with that, why don't we start with you, Vivek? 4-5 minutes of your overview, and then we'll do the same thing with Raja.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I think there are a couple of things I need to say to start off with. First, as has already been said, this is a collection of disparate essays that have been co-edited by Raja, Ashley, and me. What needs to be said is that this, in some sense, is a sequel, because there was the first version of this book was published and launched in 2014, and it was called Getting India Back on Track. So the implied suggestion in this particular title is that part of that getting India back on track has already happened, and hence, in a verb that is the present continuous, one has to do a little bit more to grasp that greatness. Essentially, the essays in this book, as was the case with the earlier one, talked about reforms. Reforms have many different definitions, the focus of some, at least the internal essays, were on domestic economic reforms and the standard set of prescriptions, whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it's social infrastructure, whether it's something else. Often, when people talk about reforms, they do not necessarily appreciate the administrative capacity of the union government and the state government and even the local governments which have to deliver government schemes. So the essay that I wrote with a co-author is focused on a little bit of that, because economists often fail to adequately appreciate the institutional background. There is one other thing I should say in conclusion. This book was published several months ago, and therefore a lot has changed in between. The answer to the question that you asked me towards the end, and I might want to answer that later on, is what kind of rate of growth does one expect for India, given what is going on around the world, and what are the reasons for being optimistic or pessimistic? Those answers today will be slightly different from when the essays were written, because a time lag has elapsed since the essays were written for this book. Let me stop there, Anish.
I wanted to be here this evening with all of you. I want to thank JLF and Sanjoy and the Steamwork Arts. I've been to JLF many times, but this is my first time in Hong Kong with the festival, India Festival here. And finally, it's also partly coming home to Asia Society here because I work for Asia Society in Delhi. And the topic, when we had this book, which Bibek pointed out the background, even I'm surprised by the fact that even in the book, many of us are tentative in terms of assessing India's prospects. The book was written during the pandemic, but since then, I think we've seen actually things really, there's much greater optimism since we published the book about India's prospects. I want to say a word about, greatness. I mean, today it's common to talk about India's rise, but it's often forgotten that in 1950, India was the sixth largest economy. This is, we talk about a divided post-partition world, was the sixth largest economy. India had also contributed 2 million soldiers to the Second World War, which was a defining feature of shaping the new military system. And India was a member of, in fact, the founding United Nations. In fact, India was even a member of the League of Nations. That India already, even before independence, it had a personality on the global stage, a legal personality, a semi-legal, if you will. And yet, the trajectory of India, in India that was really at the top. So the story was really about India's decline, which we don't talk about. That from the 50s till 1990, India was on a path of relative economic decline. This is not something we tell ourselves. This is not a criticism of any governments. But I think the choices that India made on its economic policy, of turning what was a global economy into India, saw India's share in the global trade come down from nearly 2.6%, to really, by the time we started the reforms, it was less than 1%. Today, I think we're crawling back to 2%. The fact is, India was one of the main leading economic actors in the middle of the 20th century. But I think the story of the rest of the century, while there were many achievements that India had in the second half of the 20th century, but relative to others, whether it's in the Gulf, whether it's in Southeast Asia, to many of our Asian partners, India went down. And I think today, what we've seen happen in the last 30 years, with the economic reforms, that India's relative rise begins, arresting the decline in the 90s, and a slow but steady expansion of India's relative weight in the system. So that's what has changed. And I think much of the expectations of where India would be are premised on the fact that India's relative weight is rising. All of you in Hong Kong finance, I think most of the people today, a reasonable bet that India will be the third largest economy, across the 5 trillion mark in the next 3-4 years. And in nominal terms, it will be the third largest economy in the near future. So what does this mean for India's engagement? So I think here it's often we imagine the world as static and India is going to sit at the right table. That's one way of thinking about India's rise, India's greatness. But given India's size, what you talk about India's rise in itself will produce a systemic change. That it is not just adding India to the world. That is an India with 1.4 billion people. If it begins to grow at 6% or 8%, that it changes the system itself. So I think that is the structural change. That the rise of India is not just about India's rise, but it is about rearranging the international system. Because if we continue to burn coal, we can bring the world down. The nature of India's economy will be crucial bearing on how to organize the global economy forward. And its size and its growing military capabilities will be decisive in shaping the larger regional institutional order and the global order. So it's not just an additionality to the or regional system, that India's rise relative to its growth will produce systemic change in the international system in the world. And I think it is managing this transition is what we partly talk about. But the most of the book is about internal transformation. Because without economy, the rest is a story. So the key question is, how does India transform itself internally? And here it's important to remember not to get too triumphal about India's rise. There have been any number of countries. We've seen Japan, we've seen Germany, we've seen a whole lot of other countries are prematurely imagining they've arrived, and they did not really arrive. And I think for India, it's important to remember the size gives India a whole lot of possibilities. That is, at $2,500 per capita, I can send a rocket to the moon. Singapore with $70,000 per capita can't do it as a national. So size gives us capabilities which smaller countries do. But it's also important to remember it is still $2,500 per capita. So the principal objective of India will remain what this book talks about: internal reform, internal change, and above all, bringing prosperity to the people. It's not just about India being great. For people like me, make even more money or India's greatness, but the fact is that you have to raise the living standards, bring them greater prosperity, and in doing so, size gives us a chance to rearrange the global order. That it was necessary because India's rise will also be systemic change. So I think it is that exciting moment where India is in, where if it gets its game right, it can contribute to the global order, in shaping the global order, as well as contribute to the growing prosperity of its own people. It is both these are simultaneous tasks. If you do one well, the other one will have benefits from it. And if you do the internal right well, our capacity to act internationally grow. If we get a foreign policy right, it can help accelerate India's growth and prosperity.
Let's start with the beginning. Who thought up this idea? Like, who supported the idea of India becoming a leading great power? Is it the Prime Minister? Is it the cabinet? Is it the elite? Is it the people of India? Is it a particular political party? Because reading your book, I read the chapter by Rahul Sagar, he's looked at the history and the culture. They really, for history, there's been no strong consensus or strong cultural or elite argument for India to be a expansionist or even a leading power. And I think Ashley Tellis talked about the 4 strands of thought. Ramachandra Guha, which his view is don't be a leading power, just fix your own situation. And there's Sunil Kalani, which is, we should be known for our exemplary achievements. And there's Tharoor, who says, we should be known for our soft power. The only guy I found in the entire book who was making an argument for India being a hard power was Bharat Karna. And then in history, you need to go back to Aurobindo Ghosh. So my question to you is, where is this coming from? And how sustainable is it? Yeah, for you.
I think there are two. One is the near term, one is the long term. The near term, it was really Prime Minister Modi who articulated the idea. The 2015, for the Foreign Office has this heads of mission conference every year, bringing in the ambassadors and the heads of missions to discuss what's going on in the world. So this was the second year. He came to power in 2014. In 2015, he said, look, we must think of India as a leading power. So the task of Indian diplomacy ought to be to make India a leading power. So in a way, first time is from formulation from the top of what India ought to do. And since then, I mean, both the foreign minister and others have articulated in different forms, and there's a story, the immediate story. But there is a backstory. If you see, President Kalam, when before he became president, he published a book in 2000 for India as a developed nation. It was quite an unusual thing. I mean, just the title, the notion that we're always going to be a developing country, we will be a third world country, we will be, that was the actually with which I grew up. All the time I worked with, oh, we are underdeveloped, we're going to do this constant battles. To one, saying India can actually become a developed country. It is that setting of a different ambition. I think that idea was beginning to come around, and I think I linked it to economic growth. Really, back to the 50s, I think the sense of pessimism about India across the board. That in fact, my friend Robert is reading his conversation professor was heading the he was one of the leading scholars of Asia. He wrote that in the 1960s, we were actively discouraged in the US. Academia, don't be positive about India because you're going to go wrong. It's basically a question of survival. That its structural features is not going to let it go. Remember Asian Drama, which was a big book published in the 60s. Say, look, these guys have no chance. India is lucky to avoid triage. So the assumption that India can't make it as big capitalism doesn't work. India is going to be very hard to survive. It doesn't have the food resource, it doesn't have the. One, I think that pessimism was deeply rooted. And the left and the many intellectuals argued, as a latecomer, you can't make it. So the whole argument was center periphery, new economies can't make it because they're already developed. I think Asian experience smashed it. The rise of Southeast Asia, the rise of China, the rise of all across Asia. But I think India was one of the last to join the game. But my sense is, since then, there is an optimism which didn't exist in the 20th century. I think it's a big change.
Thanks, Raja. Let's do Vivek. So, as Raja mentioned, you need to have a strong economy before you can even think about becoming a leading non-trade power. So, give us the positives. What's so great about the Indian economy? I know there's some economists here in the audience too. Maybe you can talk on Q&A, but what are the positives? Is it the big population? Is it demography? Is it supply chains being rerouted away from China and to Indonesia, Mexico, Vietnam, India? Is it the manufacturing sector? Is it the IT? Is it connectivity? When you're the chairman of the EAC, what is the positive story where India can grow not 6, but maybe 8? Vivek?
Yes, was that directed towards me?
Yes, Vivek, that's for you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I hadn't realized it was directed towards me. Let's step away a little bit from the book because as Raja said, and as I also said, the book is slightly old. I mean, the question to ask is, looking forward, what kind of aggregate size of the economy and what kind of per capita income can one contemplate for India in the year 2047? The reason I'm mentioning the year 2047 is everyone in India knows this, but others may not. 2047 is the 100th year of independence. So in India, it is described as Amrit Kal, and there is a lot of discussion in India about the trajectory leading up to 2047 and what needs to be done to ensure that the growth and development trajectory moves to a higher level. Whenever one does international comparisons, one tends to use the US dollar. So let's talk about dollar figures. There are different people who have done different kinds of projections. The range of those projections in terms of real rates of growth ranges between 6.5% to 7.5%. When one is making forecasts or guesses in terms of dollars, obviously implicitly one has to assume something about inflation. One has to assume something about the rupee dollar rate, but ignoring those niceties, the range is between 6.5% to 7.5%. These are exponential numbers. So depending on whether you're talking about 6.5 or whether you're talking about a 7.5, the terminal figure can vary quite a bit. So what's the range? Raja mentioned a per capita income today of 2,500 US dollars. I would prefer 2,600 US dollars, but that's neither here nor there. In 2047, at the lower end of the band, the per capita income is going to be about 10,000 US dollars, which moves India into the higher income category. If the growth rate is a little bit higher, let's say 7.5%, then the per capita income approaches 13,000 US dollars, which moves India into high income category, and $13,000 is roughly what you would use to define the expression developed country, although no such expression is used anymore, but high income. What about the size? The size of the economy accordingly will vary between 20 trillion, these are not PPP dollars, these are official exchange rates, will vary between 20 trillion US dollars and something like 30 trillion US dollars. So somewhere in the decade, or somewhere in this decade, towards the second half of the 20s, India will become, in official exchange rate terms, the third largest economy in the world, which reinforces what Raja said about the size. Now, what are the reasons for the optimism? The global world is in a state of uncertainty. All of that is a given. And India is not insulated because of the uncertainty. There will be volatility in forex markets. There will be volatility in capital markets. The real sector will also be affected. India's exports of goods and services cannot become a major engine until the world economy stabilizes. Of course, 2047 is a very long way off, and many of the uncertainties may disappear. Had the external world been much more positive, we could have aspired to 8.5%, perhaps even 9%. The fact that the external world is not doing all that well means that out of the four major growth drivers, one, namely net exports, doesn't get to add much. What are the three other sources? The three other drivers of growth are private consumption, government expenditure, and private investments. In the period following COVID and the recovery after COVID, there are all kinds of positive signs, too many to enumerate here, in terms of the Union government's emphasis on capital expenditure, ensuring fiscal consolidation, and several initiatives such as the provision of basic necessities to many Indians, as a result of which something like the UNDP's multidimensional poverty index says that an amazing number of Indians have risen above the poverty line as defined by the multidimensional poverty index. There are initiatives that are going on that relate to the formalization of the economy, formalization of individuals as well as formalization of enterprises. There is a huge initiative under the rubric of digital private infrastructure. The most visible of this is of course Aadhaar, but Aadhaar is not the only one. As a result of all of these, some reforms in capital markets, land markets are entirely the domain of the states. Labor markets are in the concurrent list because for those of you who do not know, the Indian constitution specifies certain areas for the union government, certain others for the state government, certain others for the concurrent list. As a result of all of these, even external observers, not just the government, believes that India is on a trend of 6.5. This does not mean that all the reforms mentioned in the book or mentioned outside the book have been implemented. Of course not. Had they been implemented, the aspirational target would have been higher. But the bottom line is that aspirational target of 10,000 US dollars or 13,000 US dollars with the resultant reduction in poverty, with a movement into the high human development category as per the UNDP's Human Development Index, all of this seems eminently doable.
Thanks. I have so many questions on the economy which will come through. I mentioned that 1/3 of this book is about state capacity. So I want both of you to answer this, to take a stab at it. There's an entire chapter by Raja Gopalan. It says, is the Indian state set up to maximize power? I think it's a great question because India hasn't really been free from 999-80 till 1947. And so what's changed in 75 years? So I want you to talk about the political aspect. And Bibek, the Indian tax to GDP ratio is only 18%.
No, it's not.
How much
It's
is it? How much is it?
It's less than 15% now.
But even lower. Okay, so my point was that the tax to GDP ratio is on the lower side compared to, let's say, 25 and 30 for our BRICS countries, 27 for the US. So I'm assuming that a government, the state, needs a higher tax to GDP intake. This goes against my own political leanings, but if you're going to become a leading power, the government needs resources. And so maybe you can talk about the political aspect, Raja, and then Vivek, you can address, is it true that you need to raise the tax to GDP ratio, or do you think it's not particularly necessary? And maybe Vivek, you can start.
So is Raja starting or am I starting? I'm sorry, the audio is not very good.
Sorry, so Vivek, you're starting with the tax to GDP ratio.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the tax to GDP ratio needs to be higher. That's a given. About 5% of GDP, which might have become tax revenue, is foregone through concessions. Had that 5% been there, the tax to GDP ratio would have been at least 20%. But the right question to ask is, given that we want to increase the tax to GDP ratio, how does one do it? And there is the direct tax side and there is the indirect tax side. On the indirect tax side, many goods and services now are under GST, and there are goods and services that might become part of GST in the future. Decisions on those are taken by the GST Council. They are not taken by the union government alone. The GST Council has representation from the states in the form of the state finance ministers and, of course, union government. The GST part of it is still work in progress. On the direct tax side, there are corporate taxes and there are personal income taxes. And I need to stress the obvious, which is sometimes not appreciated, is that while salary earners pay personal income taxes, unincorporated enterprise also pays the personal income tax. The path for reform for both these channels of personal income tax as well as corporate tax is fairly simple. The system today is riddled with exemptions, which increases compliance costs, leads to litigation. So therefore, let us move to a system where we have fewer and fewer exemptions, eventually perhaps zero exemptions. We already have these channels, the exemptionless one and the exemption and the one with exemptions. For personal income taxpayers, a large number of people, probably more than 2/3, have opted for the exemption-less system. Not that many on the corporate side. So the question before the union government, whenever there is a proper budget, whenever there is proper direct tax reform, is to incentivize this movement towards an exemption-less system. What an exemption-less system will do is ensure greater revenue, broaden the base without having to increase rates. So the answer to increasing the tax GDP ratio, certainly on the direct tax side, is one of simplification, standardization, as a result of which, even without increasing rates, we will have a higher tax GDP ratio, a bit like, if I may use the expression, a bit like the Laffer curve.
And on the political institutions side, the fact is India was always loosely governed. The colonial rule meant the British did not have an incentive to spend money on administering the country. So it was lightly administered with a small group, with co-option of a large number of local supporters, so that you didn't waste money administering the country from which you were generating revenue. So as a result, I think by the time India became independent, a small foreign service, a small civil service, and 75 years later, they're short of tax collectors, they're short of army officers, short of revenue officers, short of every. We have the least number of police per 1,000 people in the world. So I think the burden of trying to run India on the same lines, with a very minimal administrative state, I think that was one problem. The second problem was the developmental state that came in the 1950s, diverted the energy of the bureaucracy into, instead of doing the core functions of the state, which are one of the core functions of the state: law and order, revenue generation, security of your frontiers, and engaging by the sovereigns at the core of it. Instead of that, I mean, the civil service was directed in doing everything possible, including running hotels. That the developmental state appropriated a whole range of functions that were not critical for maximization of state benefits. We've not been able to change that significantly. And later today, I think the problem, as Bibek pointed out, that in stitching together a country that was diverse within a democratic framework, you have to make large number of concessions. You wanted the farmers on your side, you give them exemption. Today, freebies is one way, the constant freebies. Everybody can generate enough pressure, get some freebie. No, there's no agricultural taxation. So I think that's where, but it's not easy to track. So I would say we are, I think, in the beginning of a process. Maybe today could be far more, at least on the foreign policy side. We've seen last few years there's a growth of Indian foreign service, there's a growth of bringing other people in. I think we're at the beginning of it. But I think overcoming the historical structural factor is a fundamental challenge, because that means actually changing the very nature of the state we inherited from 1946.
That's great. Thanks, both of you. So while you have the stage, in your epilogue, you had 5 recommendations on what India should do to become a leading power. Maybe you can talk about that, and then I'll go into the
biggest challenge we often don't talk about, which is really that what India inherited in 1947 was a divided. That historically, the subcontinent is one nation. What the partition did was to really break up what was historically, culturally single spaces like Punjab and the Bengal. And the consequences of that division, I'll just give you one example. That India was divided when China was united. We often forget 1949, China's unification, the strong, in India's division and the resources into managing the new frontiers, new sovereignties, and the inherited disputes with the river waters, boundaries, we're still struggling with some of this from the division of the country. And I think resolving this of pacification of India's resolving these disputes. I think India has made some big progress in the Bangladesh side in the last 10 years. I would say overcoming some of the legacies of partition, managing some of the problems left by the creation of sovereignties. But I think our task is still there. My sense is that's number one. Two, I think the extended neighborhood, where we tended to, you see, India was very deeply connected in the colonial period. Whether it is in Hong Kong, Singapore, whether Singapore was part of India in 1967, Aden was part of India in 1957, you had actually a fairly linked open economy. But once India turned inwards economy, and actually we said, look, we don't need you, we don't need trade. But not only as one of my former service colleagues used to say, look, we were not only not open for business, we actually said, don't come in, we're not open for business because we don't want to export, or we're interested in import substitution. Therefore, in India that was deeply connected to the world was actively disconnected. Now, I'm not saying criticizing the past practice, but that was a choice that was made. But that choice had consequences in terms of reducing India's engagement in for extended neighborhood, whether in the Gulf, whether it was the Southeast Asia, whether it was East Asia, Africa. The historic connection that the empire gave us were actively broken while we met our colleagues from Africa and New York, rather than in the region, because there was not much of trade going on. So I think we will overcome that. So, but we just at the beginning of the process, India's relationship with Africa, the Gulf, with Southeast Asia, is wrong with that. Third is, India's relationship with the West. I think through the 20th century, it was a relationship on the ground. That the West is a source of technology, capital, and in many ways, the rise of China, the rise of Japan, the rise of most new countries were in partnership with the West. But I think that we did not get for whatever reason. Today, I think we are beginning to do that. That's a big change. And fourth, I would say, is really the ideological strategic culture arguments, which is really one of a very been focus on also. Therefore, you play the defensive game to one of actually seeing the big, and it will make a difference to engage the world and make a difference to prosperity. What I don't play, it's changing. Finally, I would say, it's really the multilateral world. From saying, we have nothing to offer, there used to be said about India, Indian diplomats or apologists to the Consul General sitting here. So we were the linesmen always saying offside, offside. But you're not playing the game, you're saying how others are playing as well. To one today, you are in the game. You want stronger elbows today, you're nudging, you're moving around, you're actually dribbling the ball. That is the big change. From telling the rest about a critical approach offside, you want to say, look, get in the game, we want to play the game, and we will make sure that we get a goal, that we get our disaster. That's big. I would say these are the five things.
Vivek, I've got, we're running out of time. We've got about another 15 minutes and I want some time for Q&A. So there are two areas that, Vivek, I want you to comment about. There is an entire chapter, a great one by Radhika Pandey and Ella Patnaik on finance and savings and investment story. And we have a lot of finance guys in the audience. So obviously, there's a vested interest. So where do you see the Indian financial system right now? Where is the savings rate? What is the corresponding investment rate? Is it what's next for the financial sector in terms of capital markets, the stock market, and the efficiency of financial saving utilization? So maybe we can talk about that. Then I have a follow-up on a slightly different subject, also on the economy. So Vivek, that's yours.
Okay, can I first react to something that is a follow-up to a comment that you made earlier?
Please.
What's the importance, how large is the government in the Indian economy? There are different ways to answer it. One way to answer it is through GDP, share of GDP. The other way to answer it is through share of employment. the total workforce is something like 480 million. Out of 480 million, only 20 million people work for the government, including public sector enterprises. So therefore, the moot question is not whether too many people work for the government, but whether too few people work for the government, and where should these people be working for government in? We tend to use the word government, and particularly in a discussion like this, we have the union government in mind, but there are the state governments, and even more importantly, there is local government in the form of the panchayats in the villages and the municipalities in the urban local bodies. Whatever be my definition of reform, part of it will be about delivering public goods and services, and I'm not using that expression in the strict economist term. Most of the public goods and services you will list are not delivered by union government, they are not delivered by state government, they are actually delivered by local government. So there's an important decentralization and fiscal devolution area, which is, we talked about taxes earlier, but the flip side of taxes is expenditure. And therefore, there is an agenda for reform, discussion, and debate on what should be the priority areas for expenditure and at what level of government should these be delivered. These are areas that are important for the Union Finance Commission and for the State Finance Commissions. You mentioned the savings rate and the investment rate. When one figures out rates of growth of 6.5% or 7.5%, one easy approach is to try and figure out an aggregate Harrod-Domer kind of equation for the economy. So, all right, here's the savings rate, add foreign capital to get the investment rate, divided by the incremental capital ratio, and whatever I get is the rate of growth. What this tends to ignore is that there is a lot of slack in the Indian states, slack in terms of enhanced growth. So any production function kind of exercise that's done at the all India level is easy, but can be very misleading because, as I said, the slack in terms of efficiency in land markets, efficiency in capital markets, reforms in agriculture is at the level of the states, and the all India rate of growth is summation, it's sigma what the states do, barring sectors like railways, national highways, defense, and a bit of telecom. To come back to the savings investment conundrum, there is a data issue because on investment, it's a function of whether I'm using current price figures or constant price figure, but let me not get into the data part of it. What is the simple story? The simple story is that the investment rate should be a couple of percentage points higher. So should the savings rate, a couple of percentage points higher, and there are reasons why households are not embarking on financial savings as much as they used to. Now, this is a contemporary debate beyond the book, but the moot question then is, do all these reforms lead to efficiencies? And do these efficiencies lead to a reduction in the capital output ratio? Because if they do, even if the investment rate is not 2 percentage points higher, because of the reduction in the capital output ratio, the incremental capital output ratio, I can still get my 7%. Obviously, I will not get my 8%. So let me pause there.
Great, thanks. I do have another question for you, Vivek, and then I have lots of questions for you, but only 5 minutes left. So a short answer, Vivek. So, Claudia Goldin just got the Nobel for her work on gender equality and the gender wage gap. And it's a bit of a controversial topic, but the Indian female labor participation ratio is not that high. In fact, depending on which study you look at, it's sort of 25% or thereabouts. China is 60, the world average is about 50. And there are various reasons ascribed as to why this is. I want your thoughts on that. Do you see it as a measurement problem or is it a real problem? And if it is, then how does India intend to get this participation rate higher? A brief answer, because then I have a few for Raj and then we will hear.
It's a bit of both. There is a measurement issue in terms of the question that is asked, because a lot of female employment that's sort of somewhat informal is not captured. And the ILO itself produced a paper. It was a paper, not the formal ILO point of view. The ILO produced a paper which suggested that corrected, the female work participation rate is actually 46%, not 30%. So it's low, but it's not that low. This was a paper that was also quoted in Economic Survey. Now, so far as greater gender participation is concerned in the workforce, of course, it's desirable. You cannot do it through caveat. Now, what has happened through a series of measures introduced by union government and also by some state governments, women have benefited enormously. So the gender disparities in terms of access, they have not been eliminated, but they've become progressively reduced. One evidence of that is enrollment in education, not just in school, but also in higher education. So therefore, somewhere down the line, socio-cultural norms apart, which can also be important, one would expect that in the process of development, the female work participation rate would increase.
Great, thanks for that short answer. Yeah, I was a bit surprised. And so tell me these numbers are right or wrong. But there are more females in college and university in India than men. And that those in STEM subjects, women are 43%. That surprised me.
Yeah.
That's actually really good. Okay, I do want to get Raja your thoughts on India's relationships with a few large powers / countries. So you got to be brief. So the US, obviously very important, China, Europe, and you could throw Pakistan in there also. So I know it's a lot of questions and we've got very little time, but we want some audience Q&A.
I think what's happened, I mean, I'll just give you 1990, India's trade with Russia, Soviet Union was higher than India's trade with the United States. Today, India's trade with the US is $200 billion. And if you remove the oil with the Russian trade, which is about 10 billion, it tells you how much has changed. Many of you, all your relatives, if you ask them where the kids want to go to do engineering, you have a right to go to the United States.
How many kids I saw, Indian kids I saw in Uzbekistan?
All right, yes. Part of the problem in institutional capacity, where we haven't built enough medical colleges, rather we send it. And if you see the Indian diaspora, where is it? In the 5 English-speaking countries. Gulf is a short-term language, long-term. You look at education, you look at any of the core activities, Indian people today, of Indian society is far more deeply connected to us. Reflects on every different level. So that includes Europe, that includes the Anglo-Saxon world. In terms of the rest of the world, in our own neighborhood, as I said, there is a huge transformation in the relationship with Bangladesh. But with Pakistan, I think we still start. It's not going very far. And I think the real challenge is for really Pakistan. I'll just give you one. Pakistan's per capita income today is $1,000 less than Bangladesh's. $1,000. And the current trends of population growth rate and economic growth continue. Pakistan is going to be even more behind. So I think Pakistan will have to make some choices. What is their priority? How they think about their neighborhood. But these are not India can tell them what to do. They have to make those choices. And I think India can't push them. In Asia, I would say the trade volumes are growing. India's overall relationship with Africa is growing. In the Gulf, I would say the biggest change in the last 10 years has been with India's relationship with the Gulf, especially with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which have become central partners for India. And this is a huge change from the way we think about them, the way they thought about us. So I would say that's another key change. So I would say overall, in the multilateral institutions, and I would say, look, there was a time when Indian government said, climate change, we have nothing to do with it. You guys did it, you fix it. To one where India is today taking initiatives on climate change, on renewable energy, on green energy transition. So I think there's a huge number of changes in the way we deal with it.
Brilliant. Okay, we have about 3 or 4 minutes, so maybe you can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Let me see. There's a hand, Rahul Mukherjee.
Thanks, Ajay. One of the themes both of you mentioned is the change or the pivot in India's engagement with the rest of the world, foreign policy, in trade. But if I see the actual execution, certainly on trade, it seems that Indian policymakers are reluctant to meaningfully engage in any sort of trade arrangements with the rest of the world, whether it be bilateral or multilateral. If I look at on the internal domestic economy side, if I look at policy measures, you mentioned the simplification of tax policy. If I look at the signature manufacturing measures, they all are interventionists. They're all, subsidies that are being handed out, which then are magically after 2 or 3 years get withdrawn because of abuse of the same policies that were meant to actually incentivize people. So it seems to me that while there is at the very top policy-making level an intent to engage and an intent to simplify, when it comes to actual execution, it's been about 8 or 10 years now, there seems to be a major gap in execution. What do you ascribe this to?
First and Bibek second.
I mean, I would say on trade, I'm not, Bibek is the expert. I used to think the Commerce Ministry was the problem. But now I believe Indian capitalists are the biggest problem. Unlike other countries, India has a strong capital. They do not see the market. So the kind of pressures they can bring to bear on Indian state is uncontrolled. So that's which the mantra of globalization. Today is the US which is preaching subsidies, state intervention, market mantra is no longer valid. So I think we're going through different phases of adaptation. So my sense is even the US, the original group of globalization, I think is changing its policies. I think we are in a new phase. Can we get this phase right? Where all the issues you raised are going to be managed well. I think the way is
Alexander Hamilton was quite the import substitution guy. So these sessions. Vivek, what's your answer to Rahul's question on the lack of or less optimal implementation of policy?
I'm not sure what the question was because it sounded to me like a comment. It was a comment disguised as a question without a clear interrogation. Now, so far as trade policy is concerned, trade policy cannot be delinked from an investment policy, and the government of India has been consciously ensuring trade that fits in with the cross-border investment requirements, including bilateral negotiations at the moment of free trade agreements. There is legitimate concern that many promised gains of earlier regional free trade agreements did not materialize. So therefore, my comment would be, and it's not a question, my comment would be that it's best to be cautious.
A comment answered by a comment. I think that's fair. Great, listen, I'm recognizing that I'm standing between you and dinner, so we're going to call it a night here. I want to thank both our speakers, especially Bibek, for joining us by Zoom, and Raja for being here. I think it was a fascinating discussion. I only went through half my questions. So if you have any more questions, Raja certainly will hang around, so we can take it offline. You can take a couple of more questions. Okay, all right. There's a robust gentleman here waving his arm. So you.
Thank you very much for your insight. I must say you are a very new source of knowledge. So can I put up a question to Mr. Debroy?
Go for it.
Oh, sure. So.
We can cut.
Yeah, we have a hard stop at 8, but we can ask Raja, he can attempt it.
Okay, sure. So just three-pointed question basically on gender disparity. I think representation matters a lot, and India has done a remarkable thing by passing the Women's Reservation Bill that we unanimously. So I think that's a great feat in that. So how do you basically see the Women's Reservation Bill, and especially when we have so much obstruction when things are implemented to the ground? And the second question was actually targeted to Mr. Debroy. He is also a Sanskrit scholar, so I recently read his Parliament first post about the art of lute, using the Canada as a bait actually. So he talks about statues being smuggled and everything to Canada. So I wanted to know his views on the Indian state's obsession.
Well, that's academic, he's gone, so.
Yeah, so I mean, like Indian state's obsession with reclamation of these civilization roots that we are having these days. And a question on international relations to Raja sir is basically India is becoming, I mean, I don't want to use the word aggressive actually, but then the kind of foreign policy that we are seeing these days is unconventional to India. So, and using Dr. Jaishankar's words from his book, The India Way, he basically says that when a power as huge as India rises, friction is inevitable. The foreign policy we all know is really commendable, like to use Dr. Shashankar's words, like he says, international criticism of India's foreign policy is almost muted. So what do you think about like India's foreign policy, and are we going to see some frictions as we are already seeing these days? Yeah.
I think that friction is only one side, because it gets bad news, like I've been in the media for a long time. So bad news gets, always highlighted. I think it's the extent of India's cooperation today with the developed countries, with the developing countries. That is the real story. While, these arguments will go on. I think, India was even more argumentative when it was not growing, when it was not important. I mean, Mr. Shashank himself famously said, Indian foreign policy was a daily running commentary on the global effects, telling everyone what the moral path was. I think so. People far more, Mr. Krishnan was famous in the UN, killing people not softly with the speeches in the General Assembly. So I think from there, what we are doing today is really the intensity, the expansiveness with which we deal with countries has changed. So friction is only what you see in the headlines. But some of it will look. When I was growing up, this India is a soft state, you can't do anything. So why don't you become a stronger state, address your concerns more vigorously? There will be some reaction. But I think the real story is India solving some of its problems, like with Bangladesh you mentioned, with the neighbors, building new trade relationships, expanding its market. That is the real story. These headlines are on the daily stuff, I would say, is not.
One more question? So maybe there.
And thank you for this very interesting commentary that you've given. But it seems to me that there, unless it's there and it hasn't surfaced in this discussion, a deficit in, women empowerment, bringing women into the workforce. But what are the key things you are doing, or what are the policies that are being implemented or thought of, or discussions taking place to make sure women stay in the workplace, right? At the end of the day, speaking as a working woman, men have the luxury of only working. You can reach a certain point and then the limit goes up. So it's people who can stay on. It's like a marathon. I'm a runner, so I use that analogy. You have to stay in the race, but women have to opt out of the race. And it is the biological clock that ticks, maintaining the family. Basically, sometimes I think the best description of a woman is a juggler. She's juggling everything. So what is being done, at policy level to keep women in the workforce?
Yeah, look, I think that Bibek was the right person to answer that question, but he's not here anymore. But I think, look, it's a great question. My reading of it, I did some research for this, is that Indian women do 9.2 times the amount of work as men do, and the global average is 2.5 times. So that taught me a few things, that Indian men are radically lazy. And as an Indian man, I certainly have a data point that vouches for that answer. And then also in the research, I read that there is a bit of a patriarchy and conservative values. So not only bossy but lazy. So that I mean that's a box that the country. That's why I think it's a very serious question. So yeah, that's why I brought it up. I don't have the answers. I think it's a very difficult one to solve. I think the answers are to be less bossy and to do some to do more work than 9.2 times 2. Okay, on that happy note of hopefully moving in the right direction, I want to thank Raja and I've already thanked Bibek. I want to thank all of you for coming. Round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you very, very, very much. And as an Indian woman who continues to juggle, it's great coming on after that discussion. As you know, India, by the way, endeavors to get the best of India to the shores of Hong Kong. And tonight was a testament to that. Vivek is not there with us, but just wanted to let you know he recovered from, he just had a surgery. So he came on with his glasses, and that was very kind of him to stay on Zoom for all of us. That's the reason he had to leave. But thank you to him from everyone here, and I'm sure we get to see that in the season. Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Ajay Kapur. Thank you.